There are places in history where humanity lost its way, none more haunting than Auschwitz. Behind its iron gate, crowned with the lie, Arbeit, macht, frei. Work sets you free. The Nazi regime orchestrated one of the most brutal campaigns of genocide the world has ever known. Over 1.1 million lives were extinguished in this vast complex of camps, most of them Jews, along with Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and others deemed unworthy of life. Yet the horror wasn't only in the killing, it was in the cold efficiency, the systematic humiliation, the dehumanization that turned people into numbers, possessions, or corpses. Auschwitz defies full comprehension. Survivors often said the horrors were unspeakable. Still, we must speak. We must remember not only to honor the dead, but to recognize the warning etched in the ashes, that evil thrives when indifference reigns and silence becomes complicity. Auschwitz didn't start out as a death camp. In May 1940, the Nazis opened it in the Polish town of Auschwitz as a prison for Polish people who were resisting the occupation, especially political leaders, teachers, and anyone seen as a threat. The camp was built on an old army base and quickly became known for its harsh conditions and cruelty. But over time, Auschwitz grew. In 1941, the Nazis built Auschwitz II, also called Birkenau. It was meant for Soviet prisoners of war, but it soon became the main site for mass killings, especially of Jews. A third part, Auschwitz III-Monowitz, was added later to provide forced labor for German companies like E.G. Farben. What started as a prison camp turned into something far worse. Auschwitz became the center of the Nazis' plan to wipe out entire groups of people, especially Jews. It was a place built for murder. The industrial scale of death at Auschwitz reached its horrifying peak in the gas chambers and crematoria of Birkenau. By late 1941, the Nazis began experimenting with Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, for mass execution. The success of early tests led to the construction of 4 massive gas chambers, each attached to crematoria, to systematically murder thousands at a time. Victims, mostly Jews, were told they were going to shower. They were led into large, airtight chambers where Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the roof. Within 20 minutes, as many as 2,000 people could be killed. Corpses were then hauled by Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to assist under threat of death, to the crematoria ovens, or, when those overflowed, to open-air burning pits. At its height, Auschwitz could kill up to 10,000 people per day. Between May and July 1944, roughly 430,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered, most within hours of arrival. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated genocide. From timetables to chimney smoke, the machinery of death ran with chilling efficiency. The gas chambers were not only sites of mass murder, they were monuments to what happens when bureaucracy and hatred merge. The horror of Auschwitz began the moment people stepped off the train. SS officers stood on the platform, deciding who would live and who would die. A quick gesture, left or right, meant immediate death in the gas chambers or temporary survival through forced labor. Families were torn apart in seconds, often without a chance to say goodbye. Those selected to live faced a different kind of nightmare. Their heads were shaved, clothes taken, and a number was tattooed on their arms. Names were erased. People became numbers, tools for labor. Even personal belongings were stripped away. Gold teeth pulled, hair shaved for use in German industry, suitcases emptied. This wasn't just murder. It was the complete erasure of identity and dignity. The Nazis didn't just want to kill. They wanted to crush the human spirit, to turn people into nameless, faceless things before ending their lives. Inside Auschwitz, some of the worst crimes were committed under the name of science. Nazi doctors, especially Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, used prisoners for medical experiments that were cruel, painful, and often deadly. Mengele had a special interest in twins. He would choose pairs of children, often young Jewish twins, and perform experiments on them, drawing blood, injecting chemicals into their eyes, or sewing them together. If one died, the other was usually killed for comparison during autopsies. These children were treated like lab animals, not human beings. Other doctors experimented with sterilization, infections, and chemical burns. Women were injected with substances to make them infertile. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases to test vaccines or reactions. Most experiments caused intense suffering and left permanent damage, if the prisoners even survived. These experiments had nothing to do with real medicine. They were part of the Nazi belief in racial purity and their desire to use prisoners as test subjects without rights. Even in a place built for death, these medical acts stood out as especially inhumane. For women in Auschwitz, survival came with its own brutal set of horrors. Female prisoners were constantly at risk of being abused by guards, often subjected to strip searches, beatings, and sexual violence. Many were forced to undergo abortions or sterilizations, part of the Nazis' efforts to control who could reproduce. One of the most disturbing aspects was the creation of camp brothels. These were not places of choice, but of forced prostitution. Women were picked, often from other concentration camps, and forced to work in these brothels to serve male prisoners who were seen as cooperative or useful. It was a twisted reward system, using rape as a tool of control. Women also suffered from starvation, disease, and overcrowding. Inmates were packed into filthy barracks with little hygiene, no privacy, and constant fear. The trauma they endured was physical, emotional, and deeply gendered. Even in a place as dark as Auschwitz, there were acts of courage and resistance. Some prisoners risked everything to fight back, even when the odds were impossible. The most famous revolt happened on October 7, 1944, when members of the Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to dispose of gas chamber victims, blew up Crematorium 4 using explosives smuggled in by female inmates. Though the uprising was crushed and many were executed, it showed that defiance was still possible. Other forms of resistance were quieter, but just as powerful. Prisoners shared extra food, kept hope alive through prayer or song, or wrote down what was happening to warn the outside world. Smuggled photographs and secret messages made their way beyond the fences. These acts didn't stop the killing, but they proved that even surrounded by cruelty, people could hold on to their humanity. Resistance was not only physical, it was spiritual and moral too. As the Soviet army approached in late 1944, the Nazis began trying to cover up what they had done at Auschwitz. They dismantled gas chambers, blew up crematoria, and burned documents. They also forced prisoners to dig up and burn mass graves to erase the evidence of mass murder. This desperate attempt to hide their crimes was too late. The destruction was massive, but not complete. Survivors, photos, documents, and the remains of the camp still told the story. The Nazis knew the world would soon see what they had done, and they were right. In January 1945, with Soviet troops closing in, the Nazis began evacuating Auschwitz. Around 60,000 prisoners were forced to march west in freezing winter temperatures with almost no food, water, or rest. These became known as the death marches. Anyone who stumbled or couldn't keep up was shot on the spot. Thousands died along the roads from cold, exhaustion, or bullets. On January 27, 1945, the Red Army arrived at Auschwitz and liberated the 7,000 prisoners who were too sick or weak to be moved. They found piles of corpses, scattered belongings, and warehouses filled with human hair, shoes, and suitcases, evidence of the mass killings. For the survivors, freedom came with shock and grief. Many had lost entire families. But that day marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime and the beginning of the world finally learning the full horror of Auschwitz. After the war, the world demanded justice. Many of those responsible for Auschwitz were put on trial. Rudolf Höss, the camp's commandant, was captured, tried, and hanged near the crematorium at Auschwitz in 1947. Other SS officers faced judgment at the Nuremberg trials and later court cases. Survivors began to tell their stories. Museums and memorials were built. Auschwitz became a symbol not only of the Holocaust, but of what happens when hatred and power go unchecked. Still, denial and distortion persist. Some have tried to downplay or deny what happened, despite overwhelming evidence and countless testimonies. This makes remembrance even more urgent. With each passing year, fewer survivors remain to speak for themselves. The lessons of Auschwitz are not locked in the past. They are warnings for the present and future. Remembering is not just about history. It's about guarding humanity against ever letting this happen again. People often call what happened at Auschwitz unspeakable. Not because it shouldn't be spoken about, but because words can never fully express the pain, cruelty, and scale of what happened there. Survivors have tried to explain it, but even they say some things go beyond language. Still, we must try. Sharing these stories keeps the truth alive and warns future generations about where hatred can lead. As time passes and witnesses fade, the responsibility to remember becomes ours. If we stop telling the truth about Auschwitz, if we let the unspeakable be forgotten, what might be allowed to happen next?